Universal Disclosure Podcast proudly welcomes Mr. Scott S. Smith.
All these American pilots who were running into UFOs, you could not get people to treat it seriously. I did a story for LA Magazine that got killed, but that was in 1997. And February of 1942, there was this strange thing that happened over Los Angeles. A whole bunch of red lights appeared over LA for about a whole day, and the Army shot 1,500 artillery shells against these red lights, and they seemed to bounce off like they were made of metal. UFOs are not really my thing. It's not my vision for the magazine, so you can give him an offer. We'll pay him the $5,000 that we agreed to in the contract, but we're going to kill the story and it'll never see the light of day. Or there's been a huge amount of speculation about Area 51. It's where a lot of the secret stuff was done. For example, Sandra and I knew socially Buzz Aldrin, and we knew him when he wasn't famous again, about, 6 years ago or something. They started doing all these documentaries and movies about him, and he started writing books. But we knew him like maybe 15 years ago or something, and he was very down to earth, and we talked about stuff. And, he said, all this conspiracy stuff is just absolute bunk. He says, one of these days I'm going to write a book and debunk it. But Mormons don't have a problem with the idea of there being extraterrestrials. So that it wouldn't have been a shock.
Mutilating tiny people or little people, sort of slingshotting them over. That, to me, that sounds utterly ridiculous.
And it shattered your faith in Mormonism and other mainstream gods. Why can't believers in other spiritual paths accommodate UFOs and ETs into their faiths? And why couldn't you? What happened at that point?
The following program is presented for general information, education and entertainment purposes only and is not intended to be advice of any kind. The content, views, thoughts and opinions expressed in this program are those of the individuals involved. The use of information on this program is at the user's own discretion.
Welcome back, one and all, wherever and whenever you may be. This is Universal Disclosure, meeting the moment. My name is Mike, an active UAP field investigator here in Southern California, with my friend and co-host,
Reverend Stu in Melbourne, Australia.
Reverend Stu, what's new in the land down under?
Well, we're heading out of winter here, and luckily we get very mild winters here in Melbourne. And I can feel that spring fever building up, feeling really good. I'm in a good mood today. Looking forward to our guest.
Excellent, excellent. We've got some wickedly warm weather here by the coast in SoCal. So we're full on summer, as it were. But that's why I moved here a while back, to see the Earth's sun on a regular basis. But I want to give some context to our listeners from all over the world that we know are out there now. And so last episode we had Ryan S. Wood, who was one of the main authorities on the MJ-12 program, crash retrievals. It was very nuts and bolts. It was awesome interview. But this is where we're going to go a little bit more spiritual centric and esoteric with this one. And although I don't know exactly what's going to be said, I want to provide some context overall with in terms of the religions of the world, as it were. There's 8.2 billion humans on planet Earth, and about half of those are one of the five major religions, as it were. Christians, there's 2.4 billion. Islam, 1.9 billion. Buddhists, 535 million. Mormons, 17.2 million. Jewish, 15.7 million. So that all tallies up to a little bit over half, approximately, of these rounded numbers that I got from Google, just for the sake of the conversation. And then in going back to our third and fourth episode with Kevin Day, he informed us that there was like 2,600 different religions, which blew me away. I think it blew you away too, right? So yeah. I'm just going to make a gross assumption and say of what we just said, the remaining half of the population is divided into 20 of those 2,600 different denominations of some sort.
Wow. Well, there's a lot of subdivision among those main religions you stated, with different denominations. So I'd have to analyze the figures a bit more closely, but it's still very interesting, this data you're presenting. Thank you.
Yeah, it is, and that'll make more sense as to, I think, as we go along with this next conversation. And speaking of that, I want to throw something out there because when we did our first episode, one of your friends, I believe, mentioned, I don't know if these are the correct words or not, but he said that we were both so vulnerable that it was precious, and I took that as a great compliment. I truly did, because we are just, our authentic us, right? Just presenting ourselves to the world for. So with that in mind, I feel a little bit of imposter syndrome right now, Stuart, and let me tell you why.
Yeah, okay.
Our guest today is Mr. Scott S. Smith. And in 1996, Scott launched a career as a freelance business journalist, specializing in interviewing top leaders from many fields about best practices. He drew on 25 years of experience managing and owning small firms, from retail to book publishing, and he handled financial PR for 83 publicly held companies at 2 agencies. Now check this out, though. His interviews include Bill Gates, Michael Dell, Larry Ellison, Meg Whitman, Reed Hastings, Howard Schultz, Richard Branson, Kathy Ireland, Stan Lee, Barbara Corcoran, Quincy Jones, Sumner Redstone, and on and on. He has over 2,500 interviews and articles published in 230 media outlets, including Los Angeles Times, Los Angeles Magazine, American Airlines, American Way, Success, Entrepreneur, Investors Business Daily, and he now does a blog on LinkedIn with over 15,000 social media contacts on there. Stuart, we're about to interview this guy who has interviewed the most innovative, brilliant, well-known people on the planet.
Oh, wow. I'm feeling this imposter syndrome now. It's spreading to me, Mike. Perhaps we should have recorded this intro after the interview. Now I feel a little nervous, but it should be amazing.
I'm sorry. I don't mean to do that to you. I just wanted to put it out there. Like, I'm a little nervous about this one, but it's going to be fun. It's going to be great. I think we're going to go to wonderful places. We always go to places we never expect. And Scott has a Mormon background as well, so I think that's going to be really interesting. So let's just bring him right in without any more further ado. Universal Disclosure Podcast proudly welcomes Mr. Scott S. Smith. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. And, we had you on video, but we had a little glitches. Our last couple of episodes, actually, we've had some glitches too. So it's not really surprising. Not sure what that's about, but we still appreciate you being here with us and having this conversation.
Yeah, I'm a technology CEO interviewer for Investors Business Daily. And I just tell people, never be an early adopter. The patches are going to come, and there's a whole industry of dummies books and idiots books because the techies don't know how to do anything or explain it, So let's hobble along and see if the aliens are with us this time.
Hopefully so. Hopefully so. So you may or may not know, we start off all of our shows sort of in the same way. All of our guests are asked the same first question. But before I even ask you our first question, I want to sort of give a little lead up to that, and because I think it would be appropriate for this particular episode. And I went to Catholic school all my life. In the high school I went to was run by the Christian Brothers, and in the music department there was a big sign on the wall, quote from an anonymous person, and it said, "Music speaks what words cannot express, soothes the mind and gives it rest, heals the heart and makes it whole, flows from heaven to the soul." So with that little preamble, Scott, what is your favorite song or musical artist? And it doesn't have to be spiritual in nature. It's just
Right. Well, as it happens, when I was 10, I began learning to play piano. And I was enthralled with classical music. Of course, none of my family, this is in 1960. And none of my family or anybody at school had any interest in this weird stuff. But I was so intense about this up until I was 15. I wanted to be a concert pianist, and I made a meticulous list of all the stuff that I loved. And I would say my favorite pieces were Beethoven's Symphony Number 9, the Four Seasons by Vivaldi, and the Requiem by Mozart. Now, when 1967 came, I was in a record shop looking for a classical music album, and they played Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and I fell over. And when I got the album, I loved Within You, Without You, and of course the whole thing, a Magical Mystery Tour. And I went on to really love and make a list of all the great classic songs. I got to see Crosby, Still, and Nash in person. And the irony of all this is that I realized by the time I was 15, I didn't have the talent. But I became, once I started my journalism, my freelance journalism career, things were up and down all the time. You know, you'd be hired for 2 months and then laid off because there was a recession or one thing. And I decided to go back to my classical music career and become a marketer, a telemarketer of subscription. And I became the #1 telemarketer of classical music in the country, starting in 1998, and I still do it today when things are slow. I'm now on my 3rd wife, and I had 16 years of alimony, so real money from classical music is flowing in, and I get free concerts periodically. So that's my long-winded answer.
Wow, that's great.
To my favorites.
That's awesome. And you know, all the classic rock, it literally came from classical music, so it makes perfect sense. So if we can, I'd like to just jump right into it. And you know, our topic here, of course, is UAPs. We also are focused on spirituality aspect, which we will get to soon. But in terms of UAPs, commonly referred to as UFOs, Scott, have you ever seen one yourself, or maybe know someone or talk to someone who's really credible who has seen one?
Yeah. As it happens, I had a very weird, unidentified floating object encounter in 1984. This is what sparked my interest in studying UFOs, which I knew nothing about. It was the Halloween night, and there was this big orange circular thing that wasn't moving. It wasn't the moon. All the neighbors came over and were staring up at it. We called the police. They called the military base that was about 30 miles away, and they couldn't figure out what it was. So I began studying UFOs from that point, and I thought it was just going to be a fun hobby. But I had known somebody who had, a famous person who had an encounter. I was the assistant to a best-selling author in the health field named Dr. Pavel Irola in 1975. And he and another famous nutritionist, Richard Barmakian, they left me in the office. They were going to go down and give a lecture in southern Arizona. We were in Phoenix. And when they came back a couple of days later, Dr. Irola said, "You won't believe what happened." He said, "Richard and I were getting into a big argument over UFOs." He says, "I'm Mormon, and Mormons believe there are extraterrestrials. It's kind of part of their religion." And he said, "You know, I thought, what's wrong with believing that maybe somebody from another planet has come to visit us?" And Richard was a real skeptic, agnostic, and they were arguing and arguing about whether this might be possible. And all of a sudden, Richard stopped and said, "I have the weirdest feeling we're going to see a flying saucer." And they came around the corner, and a classic flying saucer was parked up at the top of the road on the next hill. And for the next 10 minutes, Richard said, "Oh my God, they're real," over and over and over. And then it flew off. And I didn't talk to Richard at the time, but I talked to him years later. He says, "That's absolutely what happened." This was after I learned something about it. Now, the third thing I want to mention is my current wife. I didn't know in 1965. But she has had near-death experiences. She was the assistant to a ceremonial magician for a while. And she got interested in Gurdjieff. And she was driving from Hollywood up to the San Fernando Valley over Laurel Canyon. And when she got to the top, she looked out, and right off Mulholland Drive, she described it as a lighted circus floating in the air. And she parked her car and looked at it for a while, and then it floated away. And when she got to the Gurdjieff group, she said, "Did anybody see that thing as I did?" No. However, when we got together, and I started writing for Fate magazine and some other magazines, and she introduced me to Uri Geller, the famous psychic. He was living in London at a time, making a fortune off finding gold and oil and so forth. He wasn't known for his UFO experiences, but we interviewed him, and he had read one of my books on the soul of your pet about animal afterlife. He said, "How about if we do a book together on UFOs? It's a hot topic." He said, "I will pay you. You can draft the chapters, send them to me." And we had a very powerful agent. What we wanted to do, this was around the time of the Roswell 50th anniversary in 1997. And so we submitted it to the publishers. We had about 10 chapters. And they said, "Oh, we've already published our UFO book. It's about Roswell." And we said, the problem with the books that are out there is they're either about one case or they're about the history of UFOs and the good and the bad ones. We wanted to create a book you could hand to a skeptic and they would read it and they'd say, "Wow, maybe there's something to this." Now, ultimately, because it was rejected, I ended up having the chapters published in UFO magazine, and I included 3 in my book, God Reconsidered. What I learned along the way is that the skeptics simply don't know what they're talking about. And I ended up having quite a career. UFO magazine, incidentally, Vicki and Don Ecker. Don is a particularly interesting guy. At the time, he was the editor because he was a special operations guy in Vietnam, and with a crypto clearance, which is even higher, top secret. And then afterwards, he was a policeman in Idaho, and he had his leg shot up. And so he wasn't your typical New Ager. But we ended up doing a lot of things together, and that was kind of the start of it. The first assignment they gave me, a witness to a UFO that nobody knows about, it was the guy who was on the plane flying into Japan for the Tokyo surrender. And he said everybody looked out and they saw these flying saucers. This is February. Well, no, this would be the end of the war. And nobody had ever known anything about flying saucers at the time. So this was 1945. And I think the term, Ken Arnold termed the flying saucer was like a couple of years later, something like that. But yeah, I've known a lot of people that have claimed to see him, and the evidence is quite scientifically sound.
Wow. That's pretty interesting. All right, so yeah, Stuart, sinister forces are indeed at work here. And Scott, we have you back on the telephone line now, and hopefully we can make it through this one. It was one way or another, we're going to get this message out there. I tell you what.
Yeah, persistence is the key to success in any business.
Exactly. So you had mentioned that you published some of the chapters of the book you wrote with Uri Geller in UFO magazine, and then included several more in your 2015 book, God Reconsidered. Can you give us a couple examples of why skeptics have trouble explaining away these as misperceptions of natural phenomenon by like native people, as it were?
Yes, well, there's something I learned in dealing. There's two skeptic societies now. The Skeptic Society in Pasadena, which publishes Skeptic magazine, and the original group, the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, and they publish the Skeptical Inquirer. And they had a split. I think it was more of a personality thing. But the funny thing is, the head of the Skeptic Society was offended by something I wrote in Fate magazine about him. I called up their rival and said, "What happened with you guys?" And he gave me the scoop. And they said, "Oh, the Skeptic Society stole our list," and da 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 da. Anyway, they didn't realize who I was. So but what they are, the militant skeptics. There's nothing wrong with being agnostic about anything about the so-called paranormal. And one of the things that I learned from Dean Reid in his book, The Conscious Universe, and he went to Stanford Research International, where Uri Geller was tested, and he was a Bell engineer, and he didn't know anything about this stuff, but because he had started doing some ESP experiments, they sent him there, and he was astonished to see that the Soviets, who were communists then, they were using remote viewing as a tool for their Defense Department. And he thought, oh, so this isn't supernatural. It's just something natural that we don't understand yet. But the militant skeptics are totally opposed to anything that they call paranormal. And the reality is, and Dean Radin's second book, Real Magic, goes into some of this stuff, is that they're a cult. And just like the bishop tells his parishioners, don't read this book, it's on the blacklist, they have books that they don't want you to read. I've never been able to get one of them to read my chapters on any of the three things that I talk about in the book, ESP, afterlife, or UFOs. And the only way you find out that they don't know what they're talking about, they're so-called experts, is that you read the original book. And most people have not gone back to the original sources. So I did for each of these chapters that I worked out with Uri and with UFO magazine, and the oldest was 1973. 4 helicopter Air Force members had a very close encounter in Ohio with some flying saucers. And the witness testimony is so compelling. I mean, these were skilled observers of aerial phenomena, and there was no question that this was a really well-documented case. And their official skeptical explanation is they saw a meteor and mistook it. And you wouldn't realize how stupid that is unless you go back and read the thing. So they rely on their experts, like people rely on the Pope or their bishop about, what books not to read. The second one took place in 1978 in New Zealand, and a plane crew of about 8 flew from the top of New Zealand to the south and back again. And along the way, they had a huge number of flying saucer encounters and strange lights coming up towards them. And there were ground observers and everything else. And again, the skeptics said, oh, that was just flares that they mistook. And now the third example has to do with the Hudson Valley in Connecticut and New York between 1982 and 86. There were 5,000 witnesses, many of them pilots, skilled observers, the police, and so forth. And this was so well documented, and these were like huge UFOs that came down pretty close. And it's called, there's a book out on it called Night Siege. And the interesting part is that the authors were J. Allen Hynek and Jacques Vallée.
Oh,
now,
yeah.
they were the Project Blue Book debunkers for the Air Force. Hynek infamously tried to explain away one as swamp gas that had been lighted up. Vallée was the model for the scientists in Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And anyway, they finally jumped ship and formed the Center for UFO Studies. So those are three examples that I put into God Reconsidered and were part of the original chapters that I did with Uri. Now, the other thing I want to mention about skeptics is that Sandra, who she was in the whole film and acting business for a while. She's an artist now, my wife, and she knew Michael Crichton. And Michael Crichton, after his divorce, had been really upset, and he wanted to travel the world and kind of enjoy life and learn things. And he was a graduate of, I think it was Harvard Medical School. He never was a practicing doctor, but it informed all his fiction. And so he traveled the world, and he came back, and he had changed his mind. He had some very, very strange experiences with what we would call the supernatural. And he knew the chairman of what was then the Pasadena chapter of the Skeptics. It was the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. And he said, listen, I've learned a lot. I'd like to come and talk to you guys, because he was kind of agnostic himself. And the board chairman said, yeah, that sounds like a worthy thing. Well, when the rest of the board heard about it, they said, we are not going to have him come here and tell us we're completely wrong about everything. And so they turned him down. He got his revenge, though, because he published the story of his travels around the world, including the strange incidents. And then he had in the appendix the lecture that he was going to give to the skeptics group. So it's in print. If anybody picks up Travels by Michael Crichton, they can learn about another skeptic who was a convert. And again, plenty of evidence that the strange things are things that we should be curious about, not willfully ignorant.
Wow, these skeptics are working as gatekeepers in a sense, by the sounds of that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They are the gatekeepers of kind of conventional science. You up until the 60 Minutes, all these American pilots who were running into UFOs, you could not get people to treat it seriously. I did a story for LA Magazine that got killed, but that was in 1997. And, it just goes to show you that up until the 60 Minutes thing and all these reports about these pilots.
Can I interrupt you for a second, Scott?
Yeah, sure.
Because I wanted to ask you about that, actually. With the story you did for LA Magazine, I heard that it was ready to publish, and then an editor came in and stopped it, and I was just curious, like, what was so darn controversial about that? What happened there?
Yeah, it wasn't a case of the skeptics exactly coming in. In 1996, I'd done a cover story for them about the funeral and cemetery industry. And that, at the time, was a very big controversial subject because of the AIDS epidemic and also gang warfare. And so it was very, very well received. And they said, what offbeat other subject do you have? And I was writing a bunch of other things for them. And they said, well, for next October, would you be interested in doing something on the paranormal or UFOs? I said, yeah, I actually know quite a bit about that. So I pitched him. The news hook was something that nobody really knows about today, but shortly after Pearl Harbor, which of course was December 1941, in February of 1942, there was this strange thing that happened over Los Angeles. A whole bunch of red lights appeared over LA for about a whole day. And the Army shot 1,500 artillery shells against these red lights, and they seemed to bounce off like they were made of metal. They were silent. They were just floating above Los Angeles. And so they said the official explanation was it's the Japanese, but there were no bombs, there was silent, and there were no jets that went to intercept them or anything. And gradually, these red lights just floated down to Long Beach and out into the ocean. So that was kind of my opening story about how LA had been 5 years before there was any coining of the term by Ken Arnold about flying saucers. But this was like a UFO encounter. So they assigned the story, and we did a lot of it. Sandra was involved in that with me. We did a lot of really interesting interviews with people. For example, you may recall Bud Hopkins' Missing Time. It was the first best-selling book about UFO abductions. And he gave him the pseudonym Steve Kilburn, but his real name was Michael Bershad. And we interviewed him for the story, and he was willing to come out of the closet at that time. And he was still scared about what had happened. And then we went and visited Dr. Robert Lair, who was in charge of a group of about 10 surgeons who were removing implants from people who said they had been abducted. They were trying to figure out, are these tracking devices or what's going on here? But it was a pretty serious, sober business. It wasn't the kind of new agey kind of thing. And I talked to a lot of other people, including Don and Vicki Ecker of UFO Magazine and some other people. So what happened was it was all accepted. It was ready to run in October, and all of a sudden I got a call and said, we have to kill your story, so come on in and let's talk about it. And it turned out, believe it or not, they had run a story about Michael Eisner, the head of Disney. It was critical of him, and they forgot that Disney owned ABC, and ABC owned Los Angeles Magazine. And allegedly, as a result of that, they were fired. And my editor told me, the new editor coming in is from W, which is a big fashion magazine. And he said, UFOs are not really my thing. It's not my vision for the magazine. So you can give him an offer. We'll pay him the $5,000 that we agreed to in the contract, but we're going to kill the story and it'll never see the light of day. Or if he wants to take half of that, he can do whatever he wants with it, go elsewhere. And that's what I did. Now, I thought I had an LA Weekly outlet at the time, but it turned out the editor I was dealing with didn't know there was another story assigned. So I ended up running that in UFO Magazine, and I had already been, running the chapters there and some other assignments. So it wasn't actually the skeptics getting involved. It was just this Michael Eisner being insulted. That was kind of the bottom line on it. But getting in UFO Magazine was not exactly the ideal place. But nobody was covering UFOs at that time in 1997. So.
Wow. So
anyway,
you were talking about the Great Los Angeles Air Raid, essentially, which I live very close to where that actually happened, and also the Dr. Lear's implant, that was all part of the article.
Yes, right. Yeah,
Wow.
they turned me loose because they had such a sensational response to my first article. I've been writing other stuff for them, like how many ants are there in Los Angeles County? And I got the world's #1 ant authority on the phone, and we did an estimate. I would do these offbeat things for them, and they said, after we run the UFO story, we want you to write a whole issue on weird Los Angeles. I said, great, and then they were fired. And I met the editor at a writers' conference about 10 years ago, and he said, yeah, sorry about that. And I said, hey, I should feel sorry for you. He's a very famous writer now. So anyway, yeah, you would think LA would be more open-minded about UFO stuff, but it still remains pretty offbeat, and that was the shock with all these pilots with the Pentagon coming out and saying, hey, we really have something going on here and we can't hide it any longer.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, Scott. Now, you were raised Mormon, also known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or simply LDS, and you even went on missions for the church. Now, Senator Harry Reid of Nevada was a convert, and you mentioned that you knew him. Harry appeared on 60 Minutes in 2021, saying he believed the reports of pilots who claimed to see the UFOs. Did you ever discuss this with him, and was he aware of Area 51, the top secret base in Nevada, with which there are so many rumors connected to UFOs?
Yeah, that's a great question, because there's been a huge amount of speculation about Area 51. It's where a lot of the secret stuff was done. For example, Sandra and I knew socially Buzz Aldrin, and we knew him when he wasn't famous again, about, 6 years ago or something. They started doing all these documentaries and movies about him, and he started writing books. But we knew him like maybe 15 years ago or something, and he was very down to earth, and we talked about stuff. And, he said, all this conspiracy stuff is just absolute bunk. He says, one of these days I'm going to write a book and debunk it. But they did actually practice their moon landings in Area 51 because it had a surface similar to the moon. And I think that's what generated all these stories about, oh, it was faked, in a Hollywood studio or something like that. So at the time that I met Reid, he didn't know it. This was 1989, but early that year I'd had a couple of mystical experiences that I'd taken the landmark forum, which used to be called EST, with Werner Erhard, who was somebody else that Sandra knew, and I was doing transcendental meditation and some other stuff, and I was kind of evolving into a fairly liberal Mormon and giving conferences and stuff. But I was also getting disillusioned with the church in a number of ways. And he had just been elected in 1989 as the junior senator from Nevada. And I had a newsletter for Democratic Mormons, and I went there and spent an hour with him. And he certainly didn't know anything about Area 51 that early in his career. I found out later that he had actually organized a group of people in the government, the State Department and Pentagon and so forth, starting in 1995, because he got interested in it. Because, of course, Area 51 is in southeast Nevada, and people started coming to him and talking to him. So he wanted to know more about it. But at the time, I had no idea that, he would end up being one of the chief people in government to speak out on the UFO business. Mormons don't have a problem with the idea of there being extraterrestrials. So that it wouldn't have been a shock. What happened recently, when I was going back to kind of update my knowledge about UFOs, is a book had been published a few years ago by Annie Jacobson called Area 51, The Uncensored History of America's Top Secret Military Base. And that's where I learned also about Buzz Aldrin and what he said. And this book blew my mind, because I thought I knew everything there was about Roswell. I've known some of the authors of books on it. It certainly happened. A saucer crashed. Allegedly, some aliens survived and were taken off to a secret Air Force base. And the government's attempt to deny, that anything happened, of course, was silly. If you read the first part of her book, I think it's the first chapter, she does a little teasing introduction about kind of an infamous witness. Everybody was skeptical, who said that he had seen some humanoids. Either they were plastic dummies or they were dead aliens or something. It wasn't clear. He had questionable believability, but he said one thing, and this came from another source too, that on the saucer they couldn't figure out why there was Cyrillic writing, which is the script for Russian. So, at the end of Annie Jacobson's Area 51, she has a couple of chapters devoted to how Roswell came about. And I lived in Germany for 2 years as a missionary, spoke fluent German. I've got a very close German friend. I've written a lot about World War II history. And her inside sources for this seem to be really incredible. And no matter what one believes about Roswell, I think one cannot make a conclusion without reading the last chapters of her book. She said that she was told that Stalin had witnessed the panic that ensued among Americans when Orson Welles read The War of the World as if it were actually happening on that Halloween, and I think everybody knows about that. And it occurred to him that after the war, this is, as the Russians were closing in on Berlin from the east and the Americans from the west, he was thinking ahead to how to deal with the Americans. And he thought, maybe I can panic them into thinking that there's an alien invasion and they'll lose confidence in their government. And he recruited, of all people, Joseph Mengele, the infamous Nazi geneticist who was doing all kinds of genetics work. And he recruited him with the promise of having his own laboratory in the future to create dwarves that could fit inside a very small flying saucer, because it turned out that, and I know a little bit about this, that the Nazis at the end of the war had a small flying saucer developed. Nobody could really be in it, but they were able to remotely control it from another advanced aircraft, kind of like the space shuttle. And so Mengele, in a couple of years, had some dwarves that he worked with who could fit inside. And Stalin had this flying saucer launched with the idea of intentionally crashing in it with the 4 dwarves inside. 2 of them allegedly survived and were sent off to another air base, and 2 of them were comatose. And the last one, according to her source, died in 1979. It is a truly unbelievable story, except the book itself is boring with its technical detail and her insider sources. This is a wacky thing. She pretty much waited till the last chapters to go into. The rest of it, quite interesting about advanced aircraft and stuff. But yeah, that's Area 51. I think it's the inside story, and everybody should read it and make their own conclusion.
Wow. Is that technology that's known and referred to as the bell, the Nazi bell?
That's a good question. I don't really know, because I've kind of been out of the UFO business for a while, but most of the book was so boring that I kind of skipped through all the details about the advanced aircraft and stuff like that. I listened to the Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong chapter in detail and some of the other stuff, and I didn't even know she was going to have this full-blown thing after the teaser at the beginning. I thought, wow, I wish I had more, but at I think the last chapter or 2, she goes into some details about this, and again, this isn't necessarily in conflict with the other stuff, because most of the Roswell stuff is, hey, there were witnesses of a crash saucer, and some aliens survived and all that kind of stuff, and it just how you interpret it. And of course, everything was carted off, and nobody's ever seen any of this stuff since then. That does remind me, incidentally, just to throw in something, Uri Geller was always kind of embarrassed about his UFO experiences that Andrea Paharich wrote about. He wrote a book about Uri and seeing flying saucers and everything like that. But Uri is trying to make money. He's now come really out of the closet since we talked with him on Coast to Coast a couple of years ago. And he's got a Twitter account. He's got a museum now, and he's tweeting all the time, including about UFOs. And on one of these things I saw recently, he said Werner von Braun, the ex-Nazi scientist who headed the U.S. nuclear program, once showed him alien bodies. So there's a lot of strange and stuff out there that, we're probably just scratching the surface at this point.
So with Roswell, I did hear about the Stalin and mutilating tiny people or little people, sort of slingshotting them over. That to me, I mean, that sounds utterly ridiculous. But then again, I guess so too does space people, right? But I also have to wonder though, because I've heard other accounts from, not personally, of course, but from credible places throughout history, that some of the, like you had mentioned, it was like a Russian handwriting that was in the saucer, and there was what was it, Mac Brazel, I think it was, who found it, and his family may possibly still have a piece of this thing, where it would look more like hieroglyphics, but not really hieroglyphics. So what I'm trying to say here is I'm wondering if the author of that book was maybe unknowingly fed some misinformation or disinformation about that aspect of it.
Well, there was a witness that she drew on who was well known and somewhat controversial, but he didn't have an agenda. He just mentioned that this was, he didn't know hieroglyphics from Cyrillic, but I think there were a couple of people that mentioned that there was Russian writing on the saucer. It is an outlandish story, but when you hear the last chapter or chapters, the whole book is incredibly well informed about every detail about anybody that's ever heard anything about Area 51. She had great sources. So all I can say is, number one is one doesn't necessarily exclude the other witnesses. I mean, a saucer crashed. Everybody agrees on that. The one book that seems to contradict this is William Burns, who became the publisher of UFO magazine. He did a book with Phil Corso, who was allegedly involved with Roswell, and he says he was in charge of helping develop transistors, which were part of the alien technology. And, that's a world unto itself. It's a totally different story. But either way, a saucer crashed. There were humanoids inside. They were probably carted off to one of the top secret bases in Ohio. And the only question is, if they were ETs, why did they crash? I mean, if you can get here from the other side of the universe or dimensions, you don't know how to fly your saucer. And so and certainly if the saucers wanted to be found, they've got, all the recent U.S. military observers. And, somebody said, half jokingly, well, this is an insane asylum. They're really not here to kind of save us or learn from us or anything like that. But this is just part of the jigsaw puzzle for Roswell, and maybe multiple things, just like the abduction stories, maybe multiple things are true. So all I can say is I've read all the Roswell books. Something really happened. I would recommend people listen to this and then fit it into their own version of the puzzle.
Yeah, I just wanted to put out there that there's with this topic, it's very difficult sometimes to know really what is the real facts, right? And will we ever know? I don't know. I think we're sort of making some pretty good headway, but I just wanted to toss that out there just for the sake of it.
Good. Yep, the conversation is going to go on. You guys are going to be on, and the UFO magazine and all these other things that are covering it or have covered it. You know, I mean, the whole thing about Senator Reid, you know, convening this secret group in 1995. I mean, all this stuff has been studied beyond the secrecy of the official government all this time, and it took all these pilots being buzzed by flying saucers to finally come out and say, you know something, we better take this seriously. So they're just in kindergarten now, and it'll be fascinating to see how this whole thing develops, you know.
Absolutely.
That's interesting. All right. Well, you wrote that you became aware of the credibility of some of those who claimed to have been abducted in the late 80s, and it shattered your faith in Mormonism and other mainstream gods. Now, why can't believers in other spiritual paths accommodate UFOs and ETs into their faiths, and why couldn't you? What happened at that point?
Yeah. Part of it was things that I didn't talk about with anybody in my faith. I mentioned that I had done transcendental meditation and visualization and the Landmark Forum and some other stuff. And, you know, I'd become a fairly liberal Mormon and giving lectures on politics and things like that. But I was I did an interview with UFO Magazine with C.D.B. Bryan, who wrote Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind, which are abductions. And he was a non-fiction best-selling author on the New York Times, and he wrote a book about, in the book he talked about how as he gradually got into the UFO subject from the hardware side of it, and he got more and more exposure to abductions, he started losing his mind. He felt like he was in a hall of mirrors. And I started feeling like that. I thought, first of all, why, you know, Mormons believe in extraterrestrials, and, you know, why would God allow abductions from people from other planets and the strange things that happen? The best estimate is that about 6 million Americans and probably 150 million people worldwide have been abducted, and it just didn't seem to fit with any religion. And I had a couple of mystical experiences that were triggered by my constant worry about Mormonism, because I was a very faithful member. I wasn't just a Mormon missionary, but I was out there battling the anti-Mormons. I mean, you go to Christian bookstores, there's a whole section on it there. And Mormonism itself, the reason they accept the idea of extraterrestrials, and this is part of its great heresy. I mean, they don't believe in the Trinity like regular Christians do. They don't believe in a hell. They believe in works, not faith, as most Christians preach it. And so they have a lot of radical ideas, but the most radical is the goal of a Mormon is to become a god and have your own planet. And that's the ceremonies related to that go on in the temples, and I've been to the temples many times. The idea is, what they say is you don't have to be Mormon to go into the heavens. Joseph Smith, the founding prophet, said there's not only no hell, there are 3 heavens, and you will be with people like you. So the murderers and the people who beat their kids or whatever, they're going to go to their own heaven, what they call the third heaven. And Joseph Smith said, if you could see the glory of that third heaven, you would kill yourself to get there. And then there's kind of the what you might call the working class, middle class heaven, where good people go. They're not bad people, but they're not terribly enlightened. And then the highest heaven is where, not necessarily the Mormons per se, but people who have an aspiration to continue to make progress in the hereafter. So this is obviously a very radical thing compared with other Christians. The other two factors in why Mormonism is so distinctive and why I stayed involved with it for so long is that there are constant supernatural events, healings, revelations. The Book of Mormon itself says if you pray to God about whether the story in the Book of Mormon, which is about Christ coming to visit the Maya, essentially, the Native Americans in Mesoamerica, and this parallels the story that the Native Americans tell about how this white God visited them and then he sailed away to the east and said he would come back someday. And so this kind of dovetailed with that. At the time, Americans, including the Mormons, didn't really know much about that because Mesoamerica had not been fully explored yet. But this promise of the Book of Mormon that you can pray to God about it and get a direct revelation that it's true, a lot of Mormons get that. Now, I didn't really get that kind of revelation, but I knew so much about the church. Among other things, hundreds of people who witnessed the dedication of the Kirtland, Ohio temple said they saw angels flying around it. Joseph Smith had an early circle of people involved with the Book of Mormon and the founding of the church, and they all became his enemies for one reason or another, but they never denied that they saw the angels that were involved in this stuff. So it's not like your typical Christian religion at all. And this Harold Bloom, the great scholar of Shakespeare and stuff, wrote a book called The American Religion, which is largely about Mormonism, and he drew attention to the idea that you can pray to God and get a direct revelation. It's much more than feeling that Jesus is your Savior and stuff like that. And he compared it with the ancient Gnostic idea of direct revelation. So he called it a Gnostic type of religion. And incidentally, if somebody wants to know something about Mormons, Richard Bushman's Rough Rolling Stone is the most objective, scholarly, and sympathetic book out there. And he's Mormon himself, but he's quite liberal and scholarly. So that would be a way if somebody's very curious about it.
I was going to mention that from your description there, Mormonism does sound like it has quite a Gnostic orientation. And in your book, God Reconsidered, it ends with an explanation that in 2005 you embraced Christian Gnosticism. Now, could you explain for our audience, please, how that differs from mainstream Christianity and how it accommodates this UAP subject?
Right, and I didn't know anything about it. Again, Sandra, who used to go to lectures on esoteric stuff and was involved with a lot of pagan ritual magic and so forth, she said, well, you know, there's a story in LA Weekly about this Gnostic church in LA, and it's run by Bishop Stephen Heller. I used to go to his lectures. Why don't we go to some of his lectures? So I went over there, and I immediately realized that my two mystical experiences and kind of my conclusions to that point really made Gnosticism itself, rather than kind of the Mormon version, much more compatible. Basically, the problem with most religions is that they assume that God, whether it's Allah or Jehovah or whatever, is the creator. And Gnosticism has a different kind of story. It regards the God of the Old Testament, Jehovah, as a fake. He's not a God, but he pretends to be. He didn't even create the world. The problem with all the other religions is that basically they say God is good, God is omniscient, God is all-powerful, and he has nothing to do, effectively, with all the famines, the viruses, the genetic problems, the mental health problems. He's the creator, but he has no responsibility for the fact that his world is full of earthquakes and asteroids and people drowning in tsunamis and all this kind of stuff. I mean, if you read a book like Yuval Harari, *Sapiens*, the history of humanity is one total disaster after another. You know, like 27 million people died in China from famine in the early 1900s. Smallpox killed something like 600 million people in the 20th century. The vaccine wasn't developed till the 1960s, and sanitation was the main reason that smallpox declined. But you can go through all these things, and it's like, wait a minute, 25% of children died before, you know, they could get to an age where they could even exercise free will if you want. Why wouldn't God at least reveal the existence of bacteria and viruses? And how about anesthesia? Why would he have a world of humans run for 300,000 years and it would just kind of creep along? I mean, most Americans, most people in the Western world really have no concept what the world was like before the 20th century in terms of health. The problem with conventional Christianity, and I've been to many Muslim countries, Saudi Arabia and so forth, as a travel writer, and I don't doubt that Muhammad had encounters with Allah. I've been to India. I don't have any problem with the idea of the Buddhist gods appearing, the Hindu gods. You know, I've read and heard very, very compelling stories. I know the Hare Krishnas quite well. I'm familiar with all this stuff, and in God Reconsidered, I have a chapter explaining why in my search for religion I couldn't accept any of these. And part of the problem is that none of these religions explain not only why God is not a bad God with allowing all this stuff, but think about what we do with our time. Let's say we're not starving and we have a successful job. If let's ignore the prior terrible history or even the current stuff that's going on in the world, what does this world and our experience have to do with a spiritual life in the hereafter? Because prior to the 20th or the 20th century, it was pretty much just survival for 200, 3,000 years. But what do we do now? We spend a third of our time sleeping. We spend a third of our time working and commuting, doing jobs like bioengineering or, construction. What does any of that have to do with survival into another life? And the rest of the time we're shopping, eating, or playing video games, watching sports. This life is really totally irrelevant to a hereafter as taught by all these religions. So how does Gnosticism offer a different approach to this? First of all, they recognize Jehovah as a bad guy. And Richard Smoley has a book out, How God Became God, which is Jehovah was Israel's tribal deity, and in 621 BC, according to a book called When God Had a Wife, which is quite interesting, some ultra-conservative priests who were fans of the 600 commandments they were trying to impose on the Jewish people, they forged these documents that are now like Deuteronomy and so forth. And the evidence is they changed Judaism from that time. And so this is, part of how Jehovah became the Judeo-Christian God. And the Gnostics totally reject that. The other side of this is when you grow up Mormon, you don't get the Christian viewpoint on what they think of Mormons. They take the New Testament seriously, and we would read it and all that. It wasn't until I started becoming familiar with Gnosticism that I read Jesus Interrupted by Bart Ehrman, who's a former Baptist theologian. And in there he shows, if you compare Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four Gospels, all of them have totally contradictory stories about Jesus's last week. If they can't get the most important week of his life and his teachings straight and agree with each other, then how could the New Testament be reliable? This is the basis of the Orthodox Christian religion, and Jesus Interrupted shows that it's based on absolute nonsense. So that made me, realize that some kind of heresy, if not the Mormon one, might be a way to be a Christian. And Bishop Stephen Heller has some books out on Gnosticism, but you can also get audio recordings of his lectures on BC Recordings. And he basically says there were 4 Gnostic movements. 3 of them were Christian. In the first 2 centuries, the Valentinians were part of the proto-Catholic Church. There was only a church, and people went to Mass. But the Valentinians had an allegorical interpretation of Jesus's teachings as they were orally passed on. Marcion was the first one to build a church, and he created the first New Testament. And it consisted of Paul's letters and a version of Luke. And he built a church that was so successful it spread all across southern Europe and throughout the Roman Empire and Middle East. And it was so successful that eventually, when Constantine imposed the Nicene Creed in about 325 AD, I think, and made this the standard of Christianity everybody had to follow, they had to come up with their own New Testament to support conventional Christianity. But the more you read the New Testament from the Mormons or the Gnostics, I mean, almost none of the doctrines about why there was a crucifixion or how you achieve salvation are in there. Again, the Trinity is not in the New Testament. Jesus is always praying to the Father. This was an invention of Constantine and the Catholic Church. Now, after those first 2 early movements, there was a Christian group called the Cathars in the 12th and 3rd century in southern France. And the Pope and the French government got so upset with this heresy that they launched 2 crusades, killed about 1 million people in southern France. And the Inquisition was launched in order to exterminate Gnosticism from that point. And the last one is not Christian per se, but Mani in Persia in the 2nd century or 3rd century was a prophet who believed that Jesus was also a prophet, and his faith spread from the Middle East out to China, and as late as I think the 1600s, there were Manichaean temples, and they also have a belief that that the God who claims to be the creator is evil. So that's kind of the basic sense of it. I think, though, one thing that the Mormons and the Gnostics tend to get wrong, and Stephen Heller agrees with me on this, is that the idea of revelation doesn't have to be a mystical experience. It can be something that you gradually come to. And everybody forgets, everybody was illiterate before a couple of centuries ago. People didn't write diaries saying, I converted to Gnosticism because, I had a revelation. Most people were converted by listening to things being read and to missionaries, Manichaean missionaries, Cathar missionaries, whatever they were. And the emphasis really wasn't on personal revelation. It was on this dualistic idea that this world is being run by some questionable entities called archons, and they're kind of like devils, but not quite that bad. And the angelic version of that is aeons, and I think that pretty much differentiates it from conventional Christianity. And for me, the idea, clearly evolution was not guided for 600 million years by aliens or Jehovah. There's a book by David Waltham called Lucky Planet, and he says, 99% of all species are extinct. The dinosaurs, this is God's invention or alien invention. They went on for 150 years before the asteroids killed them. There were no gods, no ETs in charge of evolution. Gnosticism has a different explanation. They have a myth about Sophia, who's an aeon, who gets too curious about this dimension, and she falls into her curiosity, takes her into this world where she doesn't belong. And I think that when you read Lucky Planet, you become aware that evolution occurred with no alien or divine intervention, and that's why we're here today. And there probably isn't life on other planets of a human type. There probably aren't aliens, but maybe there are. That's not necessarily excluding them.
That was a very good summary. Thank you.
Sorry about the long-winded explanation, but it's complicated.
Yeah, no, I was familiar with almost everything you talked about, and that was very good. That was a very good summary. And talking about potentially aliens guiding evolution, many authors have written, and including Dr. David Jacobs, one of them that comes to mind, that the abductions are part of an ET crossbreeding with humans so the new species can take over the Earth. Now, what do you think's going on with that?
Yeah, I was a big fan of David Jacobs. His early book, Secret Life and the Threat, convinced me, just like with Bud Hopkins, that these abductions are not fiction. There are plenty of people who say they saw them or they were part of a group abduction. They were missing when they said they went missing and other stuff. But there's problems with it. First of all, if in his new book, Walking Among Us, he goes off the deep end. He says, yes, they need our help. This is why they're abducting the humans, to breed humanoids, because they're having trouble taking over society. They want to take over Earth. And their way of doing it is to breed humanoids. And the humanoids are too robot-like, so they need some help from the humans to make this whole thing happen, which is quite odd. As Jacques Vallée said, the medical procedures are very outdated. The body structure that people describe of the aliens wouldn't really work in outer space, and he's more reminded of the tales of fairies, who also had kind of a saucer-shaped mound. And it's something I know a little bit about because I covered the war in Ireland, and I'm the only journalist for sure who has done that, and also had a show with people who had seen fairies, and they told me their stories and to our listeners. So I had a chance to look at that. And Scott Rogo raises another question about this. He said, if you read, Rogo was one of the great parapsychologists, and he has a book called Miracles. And he documents very well that the Virgin Mary, quote unquote, has really appeared in Fatima and Mexico and so forth. And then the question is, everybody says, well, if there were flying saucers by aliens, why didn't they land on the White House lawn? Well, the Virgin Mary doesn't land on the White House lawn. So it appears that these entities from other dimensions, the aeons and archons, as Gnostics would call them, don't do well here. They have a difficult time here. So maybe there's a kernel of truth to this humanoid thing. But then you have to ask yourself, if they wanted to take us over, why didn't they just arrive here 200 years ago before we had nuclear weapons? Why didn't they? Why did they start apparently doing the abductions in the 1950s? And here we are in the 21st century, and they don't seem to have made any progress. So if there are, as estimated, 150 million people that they have been kidnapping since childhood, apparently this is something that starts early, why didn't they get on this earlier? And also, if they can come from some other dimension at the end of the universe or something, they have telepathy, apparently. Why do they have to abduct people to know how to help their humanoids be more human-like? And they're going very slowly about it. I mean, if you read Jacob's book, there are not very many of these humanoids. So the whole story doesn't really make any sense, and it kind of is the same thing for religion, you know. And so I am not worried about the aliens carting us away and taking over the world. If they wanted to do it, they had plenty of opportunities a long time ago. Something else is going on, and I think it's related to what the Gnostics said, which is these archons are like, let's say they're not devils, but they're like bad angels, let's say, and they like to be worshipped. There's a whole book out on the Hindu gods and how they like to be worshipped, and I think that whatever the religions are, you know, the angels in Islam, the Buddhism has its own entities. They all have these entities, and they seem to not really be able to stay here, but they do appear occasionally. So I think this is these entities just kind of manipulating us, but they're not doing a good job of it, so I'm not really worried about them. So I think people can just kind of move on with whatever else that they want to prioritize in their life.
I'd like to jump in there real quick to say a couple things on that. First was I wanted to chime in with the idea of, you know, them wanting to take over or whatever. It's just with this show with Kevin Day and Robert Salas, it was made very, very clear that whatever these things are, if they wanted to do something like that, they can do it in like 30 seconds, okay? Because they're so much more advanced than we are. So like you said, why keep up with all this stuff? And then I just wanted to sort of put out a little bit of a joke that's probably inappropriate, but you know, in terms of the ETs wanting to be worshipped and such, if they're doing the abductions wrong, if they did it the right way, there would be a line of volunteers of people waiting. You know, it's also bizarre. Like they come into your room in the middle of the night while you're sleeping and take you away against your will. That's not the way to any human's heart, I think.
Yeah, you know, it's odd, but then again, you know, we know that the Virgin Mary is promoting Catholicism. There's a photo in Scott Rogo's Miracles of the Virgin Mary appearing in, of all places, Egypt, on top of like a church or something. So I think that these entities, and allegedly, I've heard this from the Hindus about reincarnation, is they want to get back into bodies. They liked having flesh and blood, and the Mormons actually have a explanation for this. There was actually a book about Mormonism and abductions that came out, and they said these are the devils that were cast out of heaven, the 1/3 that were cast out of heaven when Satan would not go along with Jesus' idea of giving us free will. And Satan said, I'm going to force everybody to be good, and I'll be their savior, and everybody will come back to heaven. And a third of these we're never allowed to have bodies. So they're trying to get into bodies. Some of them, according to the Mormons, and to some extent for reincarnation, the Indians say, yeah, they want to get back in the bodies, And incidentally, Bishop Heller did an exorcism when he was still Catholic, and the body levitated in the whole process of trying to get the devil out of her.
Gee.
Wow.
Now, Whitley Strieber talks about the apparent connection with the afterlife and these encounters. And in God Reconstructed, you've got a chapter that addresses the skeptics about there being an afterlife. What kind of evidence do you present, and what are your thoughts on reincarnation?
Yeah, very interesting topics. So I took 3 topics that you would think the skeptics could counter readily. ESP was the first one, and Dean Radin's The Conscious Universe. I did a whole story for Las Vegas Magazine about him on how he was fired from there. So he presents a lot of evidence in there, and story I told in my book and in a magazine article was how that his effort to prove ESP got him fired. And that was the first chapter, and then the second one is about flying saucers. And then God Reconsider's last one seems to be the most outlandish, I guess, and that is evidence for afterlife. And again, you would think the skeptics could take this thing apart. I mean, isn't it easy to say, well, they're just hallucinating from the drugs they've been given, and the chemistry of the dying and all that kind of stuff. So they imagine they're going into some other thing, and you'll often read that, oh, well, they were really kind of half alive and like asleep while they were being revived. And so, of course, they picked up some of the discussion of the doctors subconsciously about what the procedures were and stuff like that. But the problem, as always, is when you go back to the original records and read these things, they're just flat out wrong. Number one, the drugs they're taking, the biochemistry, would not produce the kind of hallucinations that the skeptics would like to believe are causing these things. Secondly, it isn't a matter of floating on top of the ceiling and watching the surgeons. In one famous case, they went to outside like a 3rd-story window, and there was a tennis shoe there. And when the individual awoke, they said, there's a tennis shoe up outside the window, and they went up and they found it. They go to other parts of the city or the hospital and report conversations that are going on. And the other thing is, other people sometimes share these experiences. In one case that I give, a friend was visiting, and he saw this entity come in, and right before his friend died, kind of, reach out and guide him into the afterlife. Some of these people, like one child that the parapsychologist Scott Rogo told me about, I had asked him, Mormonism teaches about animals having souls, but I didn't read anything about this in the, and this goes back into, let's see, when was that? The late 90s, I think. Anyway, I said that I've never heard anything about, animals being seen in near-death experiences. He says, well, I know of one case, and a child came back, and he said, my dog greeted with me my dead dog greeted me when I got to the other side. So I ended up putting together this book called The Soul of Your Pet, which you can still get on Amazon. I published this 30 years ago, and you can still get it, copies resold on there. But I sent out letters to veterinarians and to paranormal publications and said, if you have any experiences that you think are credible, why don't you send them to me? I got buried with hundreds of things. A veterinarian assistant who said, as I killed the dog, I saw this ghost-like dog rise out of the body. People who said, I'm not religious, I wasn't the owner of the dog, but my neighbor had a dog that was taken to the vet, and a week later I said, "Congratulations that your dog was healed." And the owner said, "What are you talking about? He died on the veterinarian's table." So I had the first book out on the subject. There are others now. Now, when it comes to humans, again, the skeptics are counting on their readers not reading any of the very, very credible books on near-death experiences, some of them by medical doctors. I mean, the evidence is overwhelming, and I summarize it in that chapter. Now, with regard to reincarnation, here's the problem with it. First of all, everybody is relying on very, very shaky evidence about this. A lot of it is extracted from under hypnosis, and you can imagine things under hypnosis that are like dreams. They seem very real in the dream. In fact, when I was doing dream therapy with a psychologist, in one of my dreams, I was typing up my dream so that I could tell my therapist about it. It seemed real to me at the time in the dream,
Yeah.
So that's number one, is that you can't count on the hypnosis stuff. Secondly, everybody quotes Ian Stevenson, the late Ian Stevenson from the University of Virginia, and they say, "Oh, he's proven his stuff. He's got excellent reputation." Not the case at all. If you want to, there's half a dozen books on this that debunk reincarnation. If you want to read the best book, start with Scott Rogo's The Search for Yesterday. He goes through all the claims of learning a foreign language. And what you find out is that a lot of the claims of memories not only are inaccurate, but they're of living people, or they're of two different people that died. And our idea of reincarnation, we have this new age kind of thing where you're coming back to learn lessons and stuff like that. The problem is, historically, one would be reincarnated maybe 20, 30, 40 years later in the next village in India. These stories come from Hindu, 99.9% of them come from Hindu backgrounds. And just like growing up as a believer in Buddha or Islam, they reflect, their popular beliefs. But I've been to India, and I asked people, do you think India today is more righteous than in the Vedic age, after, thousands of years ago, after all these incarnations? Did you guys learn anything that makes you and society better? And they say, "Don't be silly. Of course not." And so, but the bigger problem with the concept of reincarnation goes back to what I said about religion in general. The living on this earth is at best irrelevant to the hereafter. If you come back, you don't just preoccupy yourself now that we're in the 21st century with, hobbies and things like that, and you're not just like a couple of centuries ago just trying to survive. The problem with all these new agey kinds of things that make this life look like, wow, we learned some lessons, is none of them take into account chaos, the natural disasters, the tsunamis, the climate change, car accidents, asteroids, war, any of this chaos. This notion that we have free will that Jehovah gave us, and we can exercise that by coming back again, is just repeating the mistake. And there's no religion, with all their talk about free will and God's plan for us and all this stuff, that takes this into effect. It's kind of like saying, well, you know something, you were a bad person in a last life. You got drunk and you killed somebody driving a car. So to give a simplistic example, you're going to come back and you're going to be killed by a car. Well, that means you can't die of polio or, a gun at a nightclub or, the COVID virus or something else, if that's your karma. Karma just doesn't work. Gilles Quispel, the great Gnostic scholar, says people may occasionally reincarnate for a variety of reasons. But he said it's not because of karma. Karma can't work. And here's the big surprise for people who are fans of Madame Blavatsky of the Theosophical Society. When I first met him, Bishop Stephan Heller said, very few people know this, but towards the end of her life, she realized that reincarnation was an occasional thing. And she wrote some letters to her confidants and said, I'm no longer preaching that everybody's going to come back. So there's a lot of evidence against it, and I know that everybody has heard these great stories about how, among Gnostics, for example, about the Cathars that appeared in England, and they could remember their lives previously. What people don't know is most of what they said was inaccurate about the Cathars, who were the medieval Gnostic group. So it's a bunch of nonsense. It's repeating stuff over and over from Ian Stevenson. There are books beyond mine and beyond Scott Rogo's on the subject. If somebody just kind of types in reincarnation debunked or something like that, you can see these things.
All right, so I'm kind of curious, before we kind of wrap things up a little bit, I have a tough question for you, Scott.
Shoot away.
At least I think it's a tough question. Let's see. You're a very educated man, especially with the various religious backgrounds. You seem definitely open to E.T. Here's the question. Can E.T. coexist with all of the various religions that we have here in the world?
Great question. It's possible that the Virgin Mary and the Hindu ETs and, all the other ones, we're touching different parts of the cosmic elephant. And none of us, and Heller would be the first to say this, none of us really have a comprehensive view. I think you can adapt any religion to ETs appearing as saints, as angels, as some kind of emissaries of the gods, as possibly more enlightened people from other planets. It wouldn't surprise me with the recent acknowledgement that flying saucers are being seen by pilots and stuff like that. I don't think they're going to land on the White House lawn, but there may be much more if they can get the hardcore evidence out. I think you could get a lot of people who are now agnostic to accept the idea that there may be entities, if not people from another planet, that exist with us in this dimension. I mean, after all, think about where we were a century ago with quantum physics. People still can't figure out what the hell quantum physics really means when it comes to understanding. I mean, just Lee Smolin, who's a famous quantum physicist, said there is time in the physical universe. We may have trouble figuring out what time is, but there's a timeline. The universe was created, whatever it is, 4.5 billion years ago or something like that. Anyway, no, 14, isn't it 14 billion years? Or I forgot what it is, but there is a timeline, even though in the quantum world, you have a hard time measuring time, and things that are seemingly in two places can influence each other. So I think that we are so ignorant about the physical universe down to the atomic and electron level and the quantum level and everything, that we should quit theorizing too big about it. Like, you hear all these New Agers saying, oh, we can time travel because look what happens at the quantum level and so forth. There's a lot of nonsense books by Deepak Chopra and a lot of New Agers, who say, oh, we don't really age because there is no time and crap like that. So why don't we be humble and say that in 100 years we just discovered quantum theory? Why don't we wait maybe 50 years before we start having grand theories about other dimensions and the galaxies and all this kind of stuff, and maybe we'll all end up with a new religion.
Wow. All right. So, Reverend Stu, do you have anything else? Ultimately, Scott, we're going to ask if you want to touch upon anything else. But Reverend Stu, did you have any other questions?
No, not at the moment, but I want to thank you for how comprehensive this was. And I'm also very interested in the relationship between the ET UAP phenomena and its relationship to Gnosticism. I've landed in the same sort of place. And it's a very broad topic. It's hard to cover in one show, but I'm very glad and appreciative of where you went to today.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry for my long answers, but it's just like there's so many issues that you could deep dive into related to this because nobody thinks about the big issues. They're busy with their jobs as dentists or whatever it is. If you ask them, what does dentistry have to do with your religion? Well, nothing. I go to church and I listen to the sermon. I'm supposed to be a good person and I try to treat my customers nice. Well, why would a dentist 200 years ago, what would they say when they didn't have anesthetics? To speak of, I mean, everybody's obsessed with artificial intelligence. We don't know very much about this world and the next one. And the skeptics are not helpful because they say it's all nonsense. Don't look any further than, the physical science that we've already approved of. And I come from the integrative medical community. I've had jobs in and out running medical clinics and stuff like that. And, it's not this way in Europe or Asia or Australia, but American doctors don't believe in preventive medicine because it doesn't work with their business model. If they cure you, you're not coming back. And we are so ignorant about health. And look at our presidential election. The average American, if you ask them something about the American Civil War, they'll probably get it wrong. I mean, I actually was going to do a book on this until I realized it could be dangerous. But we had something. The number of people who died in the American Civil War in 4 years was something like about 800,000 people. There were only 30 million people north and south. If you extrapolate that today, it's like 7 million people dying in 4 years, to give you a perspective. The average American doesn't even know their own history, their mundane history. You ask them about World War II, the only thing they know, my father was a Marine in the Pacific at Guadalcanal and other places. They would say, well, did we drop that atom bomb on Tokyo, I think, and there was Pearl Harbor. I don't know anything else that happened in between that. Americans are the most willfully ignorant people about their own history and the history of the world in history.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I'm sorry, Mike.
It's all good because it's true. And there you go. A couple of our other guests sort of said, if a UFO landed on the White House lawn, their neighbors would go back. They'd be like, okay, great, I want to go watch Sports Center or whatever it is. Like that's
yep.
Everyone's so distracted in the day to day that they need escapism, as it were. Anyways,
nobody's talking about UFOs anymore after 60 minutes. It's kind of like every so often, maybe twice a year there's some UFO report. But yeah, everybody's forgotten it. They've moved on to more important things, you know.
Well, okay, in the mainstream, yes, but in our world here, there's actually a lot of. We're definitely not the only podcasts out there, but I think we're the only ones who are focusing on this topic that we are. But nonetheless, there's a lot of channels out there that do talk about this, but it's not mainstream stuff yet.
Yep. And it's important, so I'm glad you're doing it.
Yeah, thanks. It's in a weird way, it's fun to do. It's also educational and whatnot. We get to talk to some really interesting, amazing people like yourself and everybody else thus far, and hopefully it helps other people too. There's more and more people listening every day, and it's starting to catch on.
Yeah, no, I think you're doing a service because 99.9% of Americans don't have the first idea about any of this stuff. So just getting them interested to read books and study it and listen about it and so forth, it's far more important than, watching the Super Bowl or whatever their obsession is. I mean, it just, people are fully distracted from the important stuff.
That's exactly the point too, because I said this at one point in one of the other episodes. Like most people that I know outside of the UFO investigating that I do, they don't know or didn't know much of anything about this until this show came about. I'm not naming names, but people in my family, they didn't even hear about the Tic Tac until I brought this thing to them, and. On one hand, I don't know, Scott, I don't know if you know this or not. It's a question I've been pondering a lot. Like, in terms of the UFO world, or the UFO community, how many people is that? I'm guessing it's a lot, maybe in the millions, but when you consider the planet has over 8 billion, I think it's still a minority of people, right?
Yeah. Well, it was small when I got started. Seriously on this in the late 80s. And it's still small, but YouTube and Google and, the social media and stuff have made it easier. Nobody foresaw 60 Minutes thing coming out and legitimizing this, that the government is now officially collecting, these sightings and things like that. This is the most important thing that's ever happened in UFO history because up until then, the skeptics control academia, and it's this. I did a whole show for Miguel Connors and Byte on the skeptics in the integrated medical field. It doesn't matter how much evidence, physical evidence by authoritative people is presented, they don't want to know about it. I to give you an idea that I worked at and wrote a book about that wasn't published for political reasons about the world's greatest cancer treatment center. And Sandra's mother, we took her down there. She had second stage bladder cancer, and we interviewed a lot of people that had fourth stage metastatic cancer, and this clinic had received treatment 10 and 15 years before that, and I interviewed them, and their doctors had said, "You're dead. You're going to die in 2-3 months, and don't go to those quacks in Mexico and waste your money." And, you would think they had a 53% 5-year survival rate compared with less than 5% in the U.S. at the time. So, you would think that would get some attention, but that's anything that is off the official path in any field, whether it's politics or UFOs or health or anything else, very, very hard to get a platform to talk about these things. But for some reason, whether it's the aliens or the government, suddenly UFOs are legit.
Interesting observation.
Yep.
Well, Scott, I want to thank you again for your time. It was nice visiting with you, and I guess true to form, the last couple episodes, we've had a little bit of tech glitches here and there. This one was a little bit different, so thanks for rolling with the punches, as it were, and just being on the phone with us so we could have this conversation. And I don't quite understand hardwired in at 599 megabytes per second. Couldn't get that video to come through, but nonetheless, still, it's really about the information. It's not about how we look anyway. It's about the information in the conversation. So before we let you go, Scott, if the folks out there listening or watching, whatever the case may be, if they want to reach out to you, learn more about you, maybe get one of your books or whatever, where do they go and do all that?
Yes, God Reconsidered is on Amazon. And I think it's on Kindle right now, but my son is putting up another print-on-demand version of it. And some people will resell it. So Amazon is where I send them. I stopped doing the website because I'd put in like 7 years into promoting this thing. But yeah, it is available out there, and and they can follow me on. There's a Facebook author page on God Reconsidered, and I've got a lot of the content and my interviews and stuff on there, so they can get a lot of that stuff free on Facebook.
Okay, great.
Okay, well, guys,
thank you
send
again.
me the link. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
All right,
Bye-bye.
thank you.
Thank you
Have a
so
good
much.
one. Bye-bye. Well, Reverend Stu, what do you think about all that?
Well, that was like an alien download for me. There was a lot of interesting information there, and a lot of things I'm going to be processing for quite a while. Now, the gentleman is highly articulate and super interesting, and the people he referenced and the things he's done in his life were just fantastic. I was really enjoying that.
Yeah, absolutely, for me too. And I got pretty comfortable pretty quickly. I was sort of just joking around, but not really in the beginning about the imposter syndrome. But I got comfortable with him really fast, and I enjoyed everything he had to say. I am skeptical about that whole Roswell thing with Stalin. I don't know. Anything's possible, but.
Well, I almost mentioned there's another alien account interaction where the aliens give the experiencer some pancakes to eat. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one, but there's some pretty wild stories out there.
Yeah, okay, so I think I know the one you're talking about. I don't remember the name or the location or the date or anything, but it basically goes like this. There's a farmer out in the field, and like a UFO lands, and they come out and they ask him for water so they could make pancakes. They make them some pancakes. They go back in their saucer and fly away.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I nearly brought that up during the conversation. So, I'm open to these stories, but I actually maintain quite a high, you might be surprised, high level of skepticism with all this. So I really meant it what I said in an earlier show of ours, where I keep an open heart and an open mind, and I just give everything a hearing.
Yeah. Yeah, and we said it before too. Like it's tough to know what is real in this topic and things like that. You kind of have to do your research and feel your way through a bit. There's definitely really wild stories that we haven't even touched yet. So some of them I don't even know if I want to because they're so wild. But that's like we said before too. That's ultimately where the conversation does lead. But I think we're doing good on keeping the focus on how does this affect us personally and our belief systems, and who's open to it, who's not, that kind of thing. Because that's really why, of course, we are ultimately doing all of this.
Yeah, some of the topics are very challenging for people, and they have been for me in the past. But I'm just becoming comfortable with exploring the whole issue, and I am enjoying it.
Likewise, I am as well. So the next up, we're going to be talking again with our friend Dr. Joanna Kuyala in next episode. Last time we talked to her was amazing, but we didn't get to talk about the AI aspect. And at one point, in whatever episode was before that, I said we're going to talk to her about UFOs and spirituality and AI, and then we didn't get to AI. So we're going to be excited to have her back again. I think she might actually maybe even have some more to say about the UFOs, but we're going to primarily focus on AI next time and how that plays into spirituality and such.
Oh, I'm very pleased to have her back. Always enjoy her company. Fantastic.
Yeah, that's going to be great. So we should probably get into the habit of saying this every time. You can find us on audio only everywhere. And if you are on audio only, you can see us on YouTube. You can check us out. Also, we have our website, universaldisclosurepodcast.com. And thank you for your likes, comments, subscribes, and shares. Please do keep them coming. It's the greatest thing you can do is share it and interact with us. Throw a comment down there and, let us know what you think overall, or ask some questions, because that's really what we're here for.
Yeah, I'm really appreciating the interaction and the increasing number of subscribers. It's just fantastic.
Yeah, we're getting we're gaining headway now. Considering 8.2 billion people, we've got a long way to go, right? But we're chugging along pretty quickly, I think, for still a young show. So thank you all very much, and we look forward to seeing you real soon.
Thank you, Mike.